Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I know many of you, but for those that don't know me, I'm Ryan Williams, the Chief Operating Officer at the Claremont Institute. I'm here to just say a few words about the work that we do, and then to hand things off to our panel for the evening. As our panelists no doubt indicate, we publish a magazine, the Claremont Review of Books, which are scattered throughout. I encourage you to take a copy. No, thank you. Charles and Bill help edit that wonderful magazine. Charles runs it, and Bill is a senior editor. One of our goals with the Claremont Review of Books is to advance a distinctively American conservatism. So you could say, in a way, that long before Trump, we were putting the MAGA in magazine. We also have a Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence, which is run by John Eastman, who many of you know, of course. He engages in occasional, and he and the center engage in occasional strategic litigation, but more often than not, briefs in federal court and in front of the Supreme Court to try to infuse those bodies with some perspective from the principles of the American founding. John likes to say, or joke, that CCJ is busy as long as the Constitution is under threat. So he hasn't slept for 15 years at least. I am also, my other title is Director of our Center for Political Philosophy and Statesmanship. That mouthful, I know you're wondering what that means. I'm glad you asked. I help plan and oversee the curriculum and the faculty for our 3 summer fellowship programs, one of which will start up this Friday, the Publius Fellowship. And we have the Lincoln Fellowship and the John Marshall Fellowship. And we have a new pilot fellowship that's going to start this fall for speechwriters in Washington, D.C. So we're pulling speechwriters from the executive branch and from Congress, and a few that are biding their time in the private sector. We hope they'll go back into public service, and we'll try to send them on their way with a proper perspective about how to think about America, and thus how to help the people they write speeches for communicate about America. So this is a new program. We'll see how it goes. We're always, when we launch new ones, we always evaluate, tweak the curriculum, get it right, and do it better and better every year. We have over 500 alumni now of our 3 fellowship programs, and now the 4th that we will soon add. 20 or so are serving in the Trump administration in various capacities, and we hope that number will grow. We have a few alumni here tonight. Terry Jones from our Lincoln Fellowship, Larry Greenfield also from our Lincoln Fellowship, Billy Cole, I don't know if I saw him, but I think he's here, from our John Marshall Fellowship. I don't think and Matt Cunningham, but I didn't see him yet. Maybe he's walked in.
We should give them a round of applause.
No, of course. Charles Kesler, a distinguished alumni
that's right.
of the Publius Fellowship.
I just like to applaud myself.
Yeah, no, of course. Of course. You can learn about all our work at claremont.org, the fellowships, and I encourage you to go to claremont.org/CRB. We have a wonderful online component in addition to the print magazine, which is so distinguished out front. We cover a little more ground than in the print with the online. I wanted to just recognize a few folks from the podium. We're a nonprofit, a think tank. We don't sell anything, as you all know. We don't make any profits. We couldn't do our work without the support of people like you. I know there are a lot of newcomers in the audience tonight too, so we hope that you all will become supporters too, and that we convince you we're worthy of support. And so thank you all for coming. Our Claremont Institute board members, Roy Crummer and Larry Mattson, are both here. Our host committee members, Frank and Catherine Price. We have brand new fellowship sponsors in Julia Ariza and Dr. James Rosenthal, who help make our fellowships possible by sponsoring an individual fellow or group of fellows every summer. Gudrun and Frederick Marks, and I don't know if I saw him, but I think the Honorable Mike Antonovich is here. Oh yeah, sorry. Who just finished a distinguished 36-year run on the LA County Board of Supervisors.
Here, hear.
And is a longtime supporter of the Claremont Institute and a great friend. And also rounding out that category is Michael Weiner and Michael Finch, both from the David Horowitz Freedom Center. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your support. With that, I will hand things over to my boss, the president of the Claremont Institute, Michael Pack, who will introduce our speakers and then kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. That's a great overview of the work of the Claremont Institute. I'm also grateful for you all coming. I'd also like to thank the people who did the hard work of putting this together. That would be Christine Dominich and her staff and the development team, Kirsten, wherever she is, back there. Thank you. But I know you want us to get to the main act, so I will quickly try to do that. I personally am thrilled to hear from Charles Kesler and Bill Voegeli about Trump and Trumpism. With Trump so much under attack from the media, from everybody else, from his many enemies, it will be great to hear that phenomenon defended and critiqued. And there are not two better people in America to do it than Charles Kesler and Bill Voegeli, so it should be a great evening. The general format of the evening is they're each going to speak briefly, then we'll have a little discussion between the three of us. But I want most of the evening to be questions from you. I've noticed, and I'm not surprised, that during the cocktail period that many of you had a lot to say about Donald Trump and the moment we're in right now, so I hope there'll be lots of questions and discussion. We really see this as primarily a discussion-based evening. So I'm going to introduce Charles and Bill. I will read their distinguished bio, or a shortened version of it, and then they'll speak in that order, Charles first and then Bill. I think they're planning to, are you planning to speak from your seats or from the podium? From the seats, yeah, in keeping with the more casual spirit of the evening. Charles is a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and the Dengler Dijkma Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College. Dr. Kesler also teaches in the Claremont Institute's Publius and Lincoln Fellowship programs, which Ryan described. He is the author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism, the editor of Saving the Revolution, the Federalist Papers and the American Founding, co-editor with John Kinker of Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, 10 years of the Claremont Review of Books, and co-editor with William F. Buckley of Keeping the Tablets, Modern American Conservative Thought. He's written extensively on constitutionalism and political thought, and his edition of the Federalist Papers is the best-selling edition in the country, and a very handy and inexpensive paperback recommended to all of you. He received his BA in Social Studies and his MA and PhD in Government from Harvard University. Bill Voegeli is a senior editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He's the author of Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State, and The Pity Party, a mean-spirited diatribe against liberal compassion. Both entertaining and amusing, and in some ways still as relevant as the day he wrote it, alas. He is a visiting scholar at Claremont McKenna College's Henry Salvatori Center. His work has appeared in City Journal, Commentary, the Los Angeles Times, National Review, The New Criterion, The Weekly Standard, and other publications. Dr. Voegeli received his PhD in political science from Loyola University in Chicago and has worked as a program officer for the John M. Olin Foundation from 1988 to 2002. So with that, I'll hand it first over to Charles and then Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I think this crowd looks like this could be a kind of safe space for those of us who are pro-Trump and are interested in his succeeding as president. But that makes us, in some ways, of course, a minority, certainly within Beverly Hills and within California. But I think there's a lot that we should think about when we resolve to think about the phenomenon of Donald Trump. You know, I'm very glad, first of all, as someone who wrote a book about Barack Obama, let me just begin by saying I'm very glad that Barack Obama is no longer the President of the United States. You won't believe the kind of things I had to read for that book. I mean, the sheer volume of rotten speeches and, holier-than-thou statements and so forth. So it's good to be free of all that for a change. But I think if we look at Trump, I mean, what can we say about Trump? He is, first of all, I would say, the most interesting phenomenon in American politics since Ronald Reagan. The only real Clinton was interesting in his own decadent way, and of course Obama was interesting, and a very successful liberal president by historical standards, and certainly one that was probably underestimated by his opponents. I think we didn't really take the measure of him. We didn't realize how serious he was, how in a way radical he was, and a lot of Republicans and a lot of moderate Americans were fooled by him, at least the first time around. But still, there's never been a president like Donald Trump. He's, I mean, of course it's true. I mean, when I say he's interesting, that there is the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. There's that side of things. But I still think he is a very American person. He's a very American phenomenon. And it's hard to imagine in any other country that someone like Donald Trump could come from being essentially a family businessman for his entire life, and admittedly one who did not shun the spotlight and who was interested in glamour and fame and so forth. He was a reality TV star as well as a family businessman, but I guess that's another branch of the family business in a certain sense. But he was able to come, and we have to remind ourselves, he competed against 16 other very experienced Republican politicians for the presidency. And these were people who, when we saw the field first assemble, I think we probably all said to ourselves, this is a terrific field. You've got Jeb Bush, and you've got Cruz, and you've got the senator from Florida, and you've got really distinguished people competing in this. And yet once Trump was clearly in the race, they all faded. I mean, they all took a kind of back seat in a strange and relentless way. And that, I think, was the first sign that we were dealing here with a man of immense political talent, but of course, very untutored. I mean, he doesn't really know much about American politics from a certain point of view. Most of the other 16 people that he ran against had been groomed as politicians. Not all of them. I mean, there was, there were a couple of them who were outsiders of one kind or another, Carly Fiorina and Ben Carson and others. But essentially, they had all gone to school to be politicians, and they spoke like professional politicians. They spoke very well. They spoke very eloquently would be too warm an endorsement, but they spoke well. As people who are running for major office tend to speak in America. But they were all alike, in a way, when measured against Donald Trump. I mean, the amazing thing is how he immediately turned the race into basically everybody else against him. And everybody else had a certain resemblance to each other, which made it possible for that to happen. So what we had this disruptive force, this man coming from a very untraditional starting point in American politics and triumphing fairly expeditiously. I mean, there were several important contests along the way. But we knew we were in the presence of what in baseball would be called a phenom. You know, this was a phenomenal new kind of political talent. And he, a bit of a bull in the china shop, of course. The race was rocky. The general race, the race for in the general election was rocky. The presidency is going to be a bit of a wild ride, as you may have noticed. And he will be very much unlike any recent president, because all recent presidents have essentially come from something like the same mode, the same kind of education and the same kind of preparation, whether they were conservatives or liberals. There were big differences, obviously, between, say, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, but there were also some obvious similarities between the preparations. Both had been governors, both had, had sort of come up through the political ranks and had learned how to be successful American politicians long before they ran for the presidency. I mean, if you remember, the Reagan comparison is interesting. Reagan ran for president 4 times. I mean, we tend to forget that. 68, 76, when he came very close to unseating Gerald Ford, and then 1980 and 1984. And of course, he had 2 very successful terms as president, as a governor of California. So he had immense political experience. He also had come up through the conservative movement. Ronald Reagan was one of the original subscribers to National Review. He and Bill Buckley had become friends in the 1950s. They knew each other for many decades. And Reagan was one of those people, if you go to his little ranch house up in the Santa Ynez Mountains, and you look at the little library, the rancher's library that he has there, it's not very many books. I mean, it's one bookshelf, basically, or one shelf of books. So there are 30 or 40 books at most there. But they included a lot of conservative classics. There was, I think Hayek was there, certainly Witness by Whittaker Chambers was there. And there were books about ranching and other things that you would expect. But Reagan was marinated in the conservative movement and understood its arguments and had been part of it for his entire political career, which was a long and distinguished one. Trump had none of that. Trump, is a fairly recent Republican. He's never been a movement conservative. He's never been a libertarian. He's never been a traditionalist or, a religious conservative or any of those sorts of categories we tend to think of movement conservatives as filling. Instead, he is a kind of conservative, and he's open to calling himself a conservative. He likes to call himself a common sense conservative. And by that, I think he means that his conservatism is the conservatism of the American nation, the American people. In different phases of the conservative movement, different issues were at the top of the list. The growth of government, the statism, the welfare statism of American government, that defines a lot of economic conservatives and libertarian conservatives for many years. After Roe v. Wade and a whole series of moral questions were thrust into our politics, usually by the Supreme Court, there was a whole nother wave of conservatives who took their orientation from culture, from religion, from morality, from those questions. Trump's is different from those. His, I think, he's the kind of conservative, and really maybe the first one we've had, although there are certain echoes of this in Reagan, but he's a conservative who reacts against the anti-Americanism of the left. He's the conservative who understands very well what is, if you're in the higher education business like I am, you see this all the time. Virtually every voice in higher education condemns America as an immoral nation, as having sinned a great sin, and whether that sin was homophobia or colonialism or racism or slavery or whatever it was. There are a variety of them, variety of different kinds of modern grievance liberalism or victim liberalism. But they all think that America is a profoundly sick country. And what they want to do is give us the therapy that we need. And since we will be recalcitrant, that can only be done with a lot of heavy-handedness and authority to get us to improve ourselves and to remake ourselves and to become a liberal nation for the first time that can look at itself with moral self-respect. And it is against that, the politically correct hard edge of contemporary liberalism, most visible on the campus, but increasingly visible everywhere else in American politics. That's where Trump comes from. That's what he's reacting against. You know, every one of the 17 Republican candidates, I'm sure, was against political correctness. They would have checked that box. But only Trump was prepared to be politically incorrect. Only he was prepared to enjoy being politically incorrect and to really put it right in their face, you know, and not back down. And that is what distinguished him from everyone else who was politer, to be sure, better groomed in the way of politics, but who seemed to lack that side of conviction, that, you know, the fire of conviction which he had. So I don't want to go on too long, but let me say that that's why I think I became interested in Trump from the very beginning, and I thought, you know, that he had a good chance of winning the nomination even before, I think, Christmas of 2015. And then, as you know, in the early spring, I thought he would win the nomination and probably would win the presidency as well. And I was not disappointed in that. But the reason that I thought he had such potential, despite his unpreparedness in a way for the race and for the job, was that he spoke to the American people. He communicated to the American people in a way that very, very few politicians ever could. He was entertaining. I mean, he made you laugh. You know, very few politicians can make you laugh. In the old days, in the 19th century, American politicians were much better. They were much closer to the people. They spoke more like ordinary people. They had the same sense of humor. Now our politicians tend to look down on our sense of humor, you know, and they can't risk a joke because it might, you know, there's a grievance group out there willing and ready to protest, you know, an Irish joke or any kind of, you know, sort of offensive humor that might be proposed. And by the way, how many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, that's not funny. But if looking at Trump, I'll end on this note. If I put on my political scientist hat and you looked at Trump, you would probably predict failure. He's an amateur. He's learning on the job, and it's a very steep curve. He ran in a way that he ran almost above party. He didn't really run as a Republican or as a dyed-in-the-wool Republican conservative. It isn't quite as bad as it's sometimes said that he committed a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, but he was an outsider, very much an outsider. And he did not change the legislative party in Washington. If you're Franklin Roosevelt, or if you're Ronald Reagan, when you are elected, you bring in a lot of Republicans, or a lot of Democrats in Roosevelt's case, a lot of Republicans in the case of Reagan in 1980, and you change the Congress so that they are more disposed to cooperate with you. Trump didn't really change the Congress. This is a pre-Trump Republican Party that we see in the Congress. And so they are not particularly fond of him nor do they owe him, in their own mind, all that much. And so he is, in a way, a figure caught between the Republican Party and the Democratic opposition. And, you know, purely in sort of political science terms, that's not good. That's a weak position to be in. Plus the fact that he doesn't have long-standing relations with the institutions of the conservative movement, with, you know, the Heritage Foundation and the National Review, the Weekly Standard, and so forth, means that in a way he stands alone, and it is him versus the entire liberal academic and intellectual and political establishment. He really is alone in a certain sense, and that makes it so hard for him to succeed. Nevertheless, I think he will. I'll end there.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you all here. So I wrote a piece for Claremont Review of Books Digital, didn't appear in print, titled "The Reason I'm Anti-Trump." It appeared in December of 2015. So just Trump had been running for office a few months. He was doing surprisingly well in the polls. People were starting to think, what's going on here? We thought this was like a circus act, but this guy's in first place in the polls. So I made the argument that the sort of equivocal position, if you're anti-Trump, that means you're not against him and you're not exactly for him either. You think that he's saying some good things that no one else is saying. He's bringing up issues that need to be raised. His critics are being unfair, unreasonable, overwrought, and yet doubts about his ability to do the job, to comprehend the job, remain. So that was just under 18 months ago. Now he's won the nomination contest, he won the election, he's been president for 5 months, and here I am still anti-Trump, neither kind of the one thing or the other. It looks like most of you are too young to remember, but there was this comedian, Jack Benny, who had this carefully cultivated comic persona, one feature of which was he was a notorious skinflint, threw nickels around like they were manhole covers. So one of his skets had him walking down the street past an alley. A masked gunman steps out and points the gun at Jack Benny and says, "Your money or your life?" There's a long, long pause. The gunman says, "Well," and Jack Benny says, I'm thinking. So here on the 2 years since Donald Trump became a national politician, 2 years since he announced his, took the escalator ride and announced his candidacy. I'm thinking. I listen to, respect, and don't disagree with anything Charles said. I remain concerned about, well, two things. One, sort of the quality of the work product at the White House. There are a great many people determined to thwart and, if possible, end the Trump presidency. He and his team need to fight hard and fight smart, and it seems to me too often that they have been, the tennis term, unforced errors, that there have been mistakes they've been making they didn't need to make, fights they've been getting into that distract from the main business. I know, as Charles says, he hasn't been a politician that long, he hasn't held office that long, there's a learning curve, but it's a worrisome thing. some of you are baseball fans, you might remember the Baltimore Orioles manager, Earl Weaver, famously a brilliant tactician, but also famously abusive towards umpires. Got thrown out of more games than anyone in Major League history. And there was one game where he was yelling repeatedly from the dugout at an umpire about a strike zone that seemed too small and too variable. And he got increasingly loud. Finally, he comes out to confront him between innings, and the umpire is expecting this typical Earl Weaver tirade. And instead, Earl just walks up to him and says very quietly, "Just let me know now, is this as good as it gets, or are you going to get any better at any point during the day here?" 5 months into the 48 months of the Trump presidency, it's fair to ask, are we at peak Trump in terms of White House operational efficiency, or are things like message discipline, choosing fights carefully, is that game going to improve? Trump did surprisingly well throughout 2016. The famous formulation from the journalist Selena Zito was that what set Trump apart, what was distinctive about his campaign, was that all of the people in the red Make America Great Again hats at his rallies took him seriously, but not literally. When he said he was going to build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it, what they heard was he's going to be serious about immigration enforcement. And, Ms. Zito said, the national journalists who disparaged him for a year and a half while he was running took him literally but not seriously. They took all of these talking points and said, well, obviously he doesn't know how the world works, he can't do this, he can't do that. But they didn't listen to the message that his followers were hearing. I don't think a president can go very long being taken seriously without also being taken literally. The presidents are in much more powerful and in certain ways much freer than we are. They can do many things that we can't. But they also, in a national politician, is less free than we are in certain important respects. They forfeit the right to think out loud. The way most of us can, to just sort of toss off opinions as they come to them. When Trump tells a group of visiting Republican senators, and the story leaks almost immediately, that he thought actually the House health care plan was mean and not as generous as it should have been. This is not the sort of off-the-cuff improvisation that presidents get to do and ought to be doing. To give you another baseball story, it's pretty well established that among the many people who were quite influential and to Trump look up to when he was a younger man making his way towards becoming not only a business success but a celebrity success in New York City, was George Steinbrenner, the owner and boss of the New York Yankees. Very close, and they had sort of similar backgrounds, right? They were both sons who took over businesses their fathers had started, businesses that were successful but in sort of a plodding way. And Steinbrenner and Trump each put a lot of pizzazz into that and made the business not only profitable, but a vehicle for becoming successful. Many people to this day who followed Trump from his days back in New York said his political career reminds them of nothing so much as George Steinbrenner Yankee superintendents. But the problem is that after a certain point, George Steinbrenner, after he'd fired managers every year or two and hired every big-name free agent who turned out to be sort of a has-been, and after the Yankees had gone through about 15 seasons where they didn't even make the playoffs, finally his sons and a couple of people who were close enough and could sit down and say this to him said, Mr. Steinbrenner, you can either be the most talked about man in New York and the most talked about man in baseball, or you can allow a certain structure to be settled in this organization that allows it to be a successful one. And from that point on, instead of hiring a new manager every couple of years, Trump stuck with Joe Torre, who ran the team for 15 years, and turned it over to Joe Girardi, who's run it for another decade. And the Yankees have been much more successful. They developed talent. They did all the boring, routine, necessary things to make this organization a success. So I think it's not yet clear. It will become clear in the next few months whether Donald Trump wants to be there we go, the first iteration of George Steinbrenner or the second. So I think that while that is being sorted out then, our concern as conservatives is to sort of how to hedge our bets. We have the memory of the Reagan presidency, and we know that people on the left and in the media are attacking Donald Trump in very similar terms to the ones that they attacked Ronald Reagan. And the sort of default psychological option is that we are going to commit to Trump the way we committed to Reagan. But as Charles says, there's a big difference. Ronald Reagan was a movement, National Review, conservative. Donald Trump is something else, and we don't yet know what. In my gloomier moments, I think that Trumpism means exactly what it says. It's the ideology of making Trump the world's greatest celebrity. There's no deeper philosophical, political agenda that's at work there. As somebody said, the fundamental principle of Trumpism is applause. That's not a basis on which to govern a country. I hear and see the basis for having a more hopeful and optimistic view that Charles and others have laid out. I think it may be right. I believe that Trump is attitudinally and instinctually a conservative, but whether that's enough to make a successful, to fight the people who want to defeat him and bring him down, people who also want to make conservatism impossible and irrelevant, whether that's a strong enough platform remains to be seen. So I think that conservatives need to, with respect to Trump, follow Ronald Reagan's advice. Trust but verify. Be prepared, be willing to fight him when he's fighting our battles. Be willing to challenge him when he makes mistakes. Be willing to encourage him to think of himself as part of our project, and thereby in the hope that he will come to adopt it more fully and successfully. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, very, very thoughtful talks. Thank you both. Charles, let me ask you to respond to a couple of things that Bill brought up. Maybe the first one should be, what is Trumpism? I mean, is it just applause? You have argued no, so I think that it would be good to hear that. And part of that is, part of the question I think Bill raised is will there be other Trumpists? Will it have a legacy? Will there be Trumpism beyond Trump? And what is it? So,
okay, good. Thank you. Well, it's a little early to tell what Trumpism is, or if there really is going to be something which we might call Trumpism. Look, not every president gets an ism. Not every president needs an ism. You know, very few presidents actually, are elevated, if that's the right term, into an ism. So you've got, Wilsonianism, you've got Jeffersonianism, but there's really there was no Nixonism, there was no Carterism, there's really no Rooseveltism. I mean, it's odd who gets an ism and who doesn't. It's not clear what the principle is, but Trump is not doctrinal. He's not interested in spelling out the principles that lie behind his decisions. He's interested in getting things done. He has a very practical, sort of businessman's appreciation for the bottom line. Did we change things? Did we change things in a good way? And what did it cost to do that, or what will it cost us to do that? And so I don't hold it against him that there isn't really yet a doctrine or a series of doctrines that you could call Trumpism. However, I will say, and this is something that I've written in National Reviews, and of all places in the New York Times, that if you look at the policies that the Trump administration has pursued, there's a strange resemblance to the main public policies of the old Republican Party. I mean the old Republican Party before the New Deal and before the Cold War. If you go back to the party of Calvin Coolidge, of William McKinley, and even of Abraham Lincoln, what were the principal public policy positions that it took? First of all, a high protective tariff. The Republicans used to be the party of high tariffs. Second, infrastructure spending, internal improvements, as they were called. It's the Republicans who built not only the interstate highway system, but the Intercontinental Railroad, in 1864, who built a whole series of canals and other national forms of transportation, infrastructure. That's exactly what Trump wants to renew. He wants to do that again. If you look at the old Republican Party, they were also very interested in judges who would defend the Constitution against legislative innovations. If you think about all those judges who kept striking down the New Deal laws in the first couple of years of the New Deal, those were all Republican, not all, they weren't all Republican appointees, but most of them were Republican appointees who thought that the Constitution set the boundaries of Congress's power and national power in America, and by God, the point of the courts was to enforce the Constitution. For many years, Republicans have been confused about this question, and in a way, Trump represents a kind of clearer return to that old doctrine that we want the courts to enforce against legislatures limits set in the Constitution. But in foreign policy terms, the old Republican Party was not a nation-building party. They were not really invested in the export of democracy abroad. They were invested in the defense of American national interests and of American honor. And they were very clear. Those were two things. They weren't exactly the same thing. Both were, however, important. So, strangely, I mean, most of the agenda of the Trump administration seems to be not like contemporary conservatism so much as like the older conservatism that predates the New Deal. And so I think if you wanted to talk about the principles of the Trump administration, you would be talking about a kind of partial return to a much older Republican tradition in the country. And I think it's important to realize that because I think we tend to think what the media tells us to think, which is that Trump has just made all this up. And they're just a series of positions that, have come to him in some way, watching late night cable TV or something, or early morning cable TV. But there is, in fact, there's a dignity to the set of positions that he has taken. And if you wanted to be fancy about it, I think you could say that there's a real, if something is really going on here, I would say it might be a new kind of conservative fusionism between the old conservatism, pre-New Deal, and the post, or pre-Cold War, let's say, and the post-Cold War conservatism of the contemporary conservative movement.
I have another question to ask you coming from Bill's talk, but let me ask Bill, do you want to respond to what Charles just said? Do you feel that answers the question, what is Trump for, what is Trumpism?
Maybe. I mean, there are even more elaborate, I was telling Kurt this before we sat down, there have been many efforts to sort of theorize, intellectualize Trumpism. There are things to be said for and against many of them. One worry I have is that I'm not sure if you sat down in the Oval Office with President Trump and said, "Sir, here's what you're up to." He would A, agree, or B, comprehend this. I mean, maybe, but I worry that we're sort of ascribing opinions and worldviews to him that may tell us more about us than him. Nevertheless, I think that there are a couple of reasons to think that there's more going on, and that what's going on is can be somewhat reassuring. One is that clearly Donald Trump, compared to, say, Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan, he's unlike he's not a normal politician. He doesn't have the long sort of immersion in the Republican Party and the conservative project. But one perverse benefit of the hysterical and vicious reaction to his election that started the minute Hillary Clinton called him on the morning of November 9th, the demonstrations, the resistance and all of that, was that it became clear immediately that whatever thoughts Trump might have had about how he, the master deal maker, was going to broker things and get stuff done and sit down with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and that was all by the boards. It became clear immediately that whether he was going to be a much more Republican president than probably he ever really intended or understood, because there was simply no deals to be made, no votes to be won, no margin to be granted to him by the Democrats in the media or on Capitol Hill or around the country. And so, therefore, even if what Trump is about and what more sort of normal mainstream conservative Republicans like Ryan and McConnell are about is hard to reconcile, they need each other. McConnell and Ryan have been trying to pass legislation, having President Obama veto it. Now they have a guy who'll sign it. They've been seeing liberals appointed to the judiciary and administrative positions. Now they see their people. Trump knows that as long as he has that majority and he has a good reason to fight to keep that majority on Capitol Hill, that his life will be a lot easier. So there are, if not very different interests, that sort of interlocking ones. The other thing that I think Trumpism could maybe sort of be about, and that dovetails with conservatism as we've understood it, is on this issue of populism. I go back to the famous 54-year-old line of William Buckley's that he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone book than the 2,000 members of the Harvard faculty. It seems to me that that populist sentiment would resonate completely at a Make America Great Again rally. These are people who, in that Jacksonian way, feel that they've been looked down upon, they've been disregarded, they've been dismissed, and they have in Donald Trump a president who respects them and takes them seriously. It seems to me that it would both in terms of the policy agenda and in terms of its attitude, its sort of the way it presents itself to the world. Conservatism will be, after Trump, will be stronger than it was before if it incorporates and makes manifest that attitude.
Good. Let me ask one more question before we throw it up to the audience to ask questions. By the way, I always when I hear that Buckley comment, I always think that I'd rather be governed by the 2,000 members of the Harvard faculty when he made the comment than by the current members of the Harvard faculty. So it's gotten a lot worse, significantly worse. Charles, Bill raised another...
Plus, it was a Yaley.
Well, that's right. He had a prejudice.
So he may have been blind to the merits of the Harvard faculty.
He might have been. He was pretty hard on Yale, though, too. God and man at Yale. Let me ask you about another point that Bill raised, Charles, and that is how he's governing. You raised this question even during the campaign, that his inexperience might make it hard for him to be successful in office. Not what he intends to do, but how will he manage to achieve it? And Bill raised some of those questions of the troubles he's having now. So what do you think of that as a problem now, and how do you think he's dealing with it?
Those are all legitimate questions. One thing that you notice is that there is no one in the White House who could offer him seasoned political advice. I mean, the truth is he surrounded himself with some very impressive military people, but they're not politicians, and they don't know Congress, that's not, how a bill becomes a law is not their specialty. But if you look at the rest of the staff, Stephen Bannon, whatever his virtues, is a complete political novice. I mean, he's never run for office, never held office, never really been in an administration. Sean Spicer and Priebus are Wisconsin products. They come from state politics. They haven't really had, and in state politics they were not that high up. And so they too have had very limited political experience. I mean, you look around for someone who would be the equivalent of an Ed Meese or a Jim Baker, or someone who has been there before, or at least been in similar situations before, and could give sort of, man to man, could give some quiet, wise advice. And it's not impossible that he will turn to someone or find someone or some set of people who can counsel him, but he badly needs such people around him, I would say. I mean, they're hard to find. It's a long time since the Reagan years. Yeah. Nonetheless, I don't think it's impossible that he will get better at that side of it because he'll have better advice. Now, there is, Bill mentioned Andrew Jackson, and it's true, that's his favorite president. Not Calvin Coolidge or Abraham Lincoln or, the ones I'm pushing. So you have to take my thesis with a grain of salt. And I'm aware of Bill's caution that I don't want to put ideas in Trump's head, although I would like to put some ideas in Trump's head, but I don't want to attribute ideas to him that aren't there. But he is interested in Jackson. And if you read a little bit about the life of Jackson, Andrew Jackson, there are some striking similarities between Jackson and Trump in their temperaments above all. And so it's not, I said earlier that there's never been a president like Donald Trump, and that's true, but there have been some presidents that one can learn a little bit, I think, about Trump by looking at them. And Jackson would be probably the biggest example of that. But Andrew Jackson, who was a tremendous disruptor and a kind of revolutionary when he came to Washington, unlike Trump, had a lot of political experience. He'd been a senator, he'd been a congressman, he'd been a judge, he'd been a governor, and he'd held numerous lesser offices, and he was a lawyer to boot. So, he had some accomplishments which would differentiate him from Trump, and in some ways he was much more temperamental, angry, tempestuous than Trump. Andrew Jackson killed a man in a duel over a horse race. And that was not the only duel he ever fought.
Bill, do you want to make a further comment on this subject before we go to the audience?
As Charles often says, we're in heated agreement. So
Yes, right. Okay, I think questions from the audience now. Let me, Michael Finch, wait for the mic to come to you, please.
A question for Bill, but Charles, just to speak to your fusion, we have a man who has the support of West Coast Straussians and Paleo conservatives, which is rare, so that's the conservative fusion. But Bill, Earl Weaver managed a clubhouse of superstars and huge egos. So when he would kick the dirt on the umpire's feet, he was always protecting his players, keeping the attention and the focus on him and protecting the clubhouse. So a lot of good things have happened in 5 months behind the scenes that we don't hear about because all the focus is chasing Trump. So I don't want to give Trump too much credit, but could there be a method to the madness?
there could be, sure. Nevertheless, there could be a method to somewhat less madness.
Okay.
Sort of on this question of ascribing opinions and philosophies, seeing every tweet as part of a grand Machiavellian strategy is not impossible, but you do again wonder if maybe a little more coordination of the message would help the cause.
Okay.
But I would say in defense of Trump on this, they're out to get him.
Yeah, very true.
I mean, this is a very tough situation because his legitimacy is under question here, and the whole Russian, nonsense is especially now that there's a special counsel, is designed to consume the rest of his presidency, if not shortening the term of his presidency. And it's very hard to keep your focus when those wild dogs are pursuing you. But having said so, I mean, I think Bill would agree that there's been a lot of good policy making so far under Trump. I mean, Gorsuch's nomination is first item I think we'd all think of. But then there's been a lot of regulatory reform and some interesting things, depending on your view of this, but still interesting things that Wilbur Ross is doing at Commerce. He's a very smart guy. I think I'm impressed with him so far. And so I guess I take a slightly more forgiving view of what's been accomplished so far. I mean, this could be, in a way, if Trump manages to survive and to bully his way through, we could have a golden age of conservative policymaking, like unto the Reagan, the first term of Ronald Reagan here. But it's going to be very difficult. Even with Republican Congress, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, the degree of attack is amazing, and I think only a person that had Trump's unusual attributes would be able to survive it. So some of those peculiar things that work against him help him too. I mean, it's such an odd moment. We have a question way up front here. Keep you moving, Kirsten.
Charles, could you comment on the precarious geopolitical situation and how Trump, representing a 100-year-old philosophy, is going to be able and is dealing with all these challenges that I don't think anybody's seen before to this extreme.
You mean in the international setting?
It's just unreal what's going on. The cyber war, number one, all these things I'm sure you know about, that whatever you're willing to comment on.
Yes. Well, I would just say, look, in a certain way, from the international point of view, one could argue that Trump is succeeding two failed presidents. I mean, the Bush presidency, despite its good intentions and some successes, had just inglorious failure after failure in the Middle East. And then Trump's Obama's foreign policy was a kind of, self-willed disaster. And so there's a lot of ground to be made up in the Trump administration. And so far, I think he's doing pretty well. I think that he's taking the right line, which is to walk back the whole Bush-era democratization stuff and to concentrate on what we can actually do, which is to defend our interests, define and defend our interests, and our honor. He is, in some ways, he wears his heart on his sleeve. I mean, his reaction to the children being slaughtered in Syria, his reaction to the warm beer fellow coming home in a coma and dying. I mean, I think one senses that he is genuinely outraged by these things in a way that professional politicians maybe are taught to hide. And he sort of lets it all hang out. But I think that's, in a way, it's a kind of modest honesty that is better than many of the elaborate falsehoods of professional, foreign policy in the last 16 years.
Bill, do you want to comment on his foreign policy? I mean, it is so that often presidents are tested in the foreign policy realm in a way they didn't anticipate, and I think things like North Korea are going to make it very hard for him in the next year, if not sooner. Because of the failures he's inherited, some of them he can't just roll back so easily, and that'll really be a challenge.
No, the problems are all worse than they were 8 years ago or 16 years ago. And so, I mean, that means that, the standard we're going to apply to him is going to be very high, and so he could fail in foreign policy. But I think he's taking it very seriously, and he will learn eventually, of course, the limitations of listening to generals. I mean, this is one thing all presidents eventually learn, that sometimes they don't know everything. And they have a certain kind of expertise, and you can't not listen to them, but you don't have to do what they advise you to do either, in all cases. No, they're not. I mean, their point of view is from the military, but you, as president, have a much larger point of view that you have to work with.
I think in North Korea, for instance, Donald Trump will have to decide, is it acceptable for North Korea to have ICBMs with nuclear missiles that can land on, say, Los Angeles? Right. I mean, what's he going to do about that? I mean, that is not a general's decision. Right. It's a president's decision, and it's extremely hard decision to make. So I think that's right.
As our friend Michael Ullman has sometimes said, the key parts of the job of being president are not delegatable.
That's right. That's right.
So he can seek advice from many good people, but it's the guy at the desk alone making the final decision. Yeah,
that will be hard. All right, now there's a question way back there, Kirsten.
I mean, I totally agree with all three of you that I would love for there to be less chaos. Can nobody hear me? Is the microphone working? I would love for there to be less chaos. I would love for someone to take his phone away and break all of his fingers. However, it's Trump. So, a lot of the reason why he got elected is because of that Twitter. American people are just, I go to Florida every 3 months and I change planes in Atlanta. And when I get on the plane in Atlanta and I go to Sarasota, I'm invariably sitting next to somebody who lives in one of those flyover states or something. And they are just fed up. I think Donald Trump is as incredulous as any of us would be if we suddenly found ourselves in the White House and said, why can't we do this? Why have we always done it that way? That's just the stupidest thing on earth. And if you think about it, with regards to North Korea, it's not just the last 16 years, but if you go back to Clinton and Madeleine Albright, we also have an enabling of North Korean, their policy of you know, everyone's afraid of us because we're going to send a nuclear weapon to Seoul and then to Los Angeles, and who cares if we all die? So I think that, you know, the American people are with him in the fact that we would all be sitting there saying, oh my God, what a mess. And I think that's what he's thinking, really. And he's very passionate about America. He loves the United States. You can tell that. And I think that's how a lot of us feel. We fly our American flags. We tell our military, thank you for your service. We mean it. And I believe that's how he feels, and that's what his great base of appeal is. Just my opinion.
Do you want to, either of you want to respond to that? I think that that's the sense that you reflect the sense that he has this common sense conservatism and speaks for the American people that haven't had a voice in a long time. And I think that really is his strength. And it's still his strength. I heard a little of his Iowa speech before I came here, and you could see that he is still doing that and speaking for them, and he's getting that response. And that is a unique thing about Trump. He has really tapped into it, and that is transformative on the American scene. And I think that is still there. And you do feel it when you get away from the coast. I agree with you completely, even though we love it here in Beverly Hills. Do anyone want to address anything further on that?
Another question.
Another question, okay. All right. You promised to ask a question, and now you are. Good.
I can't help but possibly following up Charles. I apologize in advance, but I just love to listen to academics attempt to describe an entrepreneur. It's about what works, and you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to experiment, and flyover country. I mean, I've got a project in Kingman, Arizona, for example. At minimum, I mean, you can't go anywhere in that town that I'd say 80% of the people are Trump people. You can go any place in the Midwest, you see Trump stuff all over the place still. Okay, what we on these two coasts get, or it's almost like intellectual incest. The part I like about what Charles said was, Jacksonian, but we can go beyond that. But think about it. When did we separate economics and politics? Well, just about around 1900, academics separated economics and politics. I'm here to tell you that politics is a branch of capitalism economics. But anyway, respond to that, Charles. I just love it when you...
I'm very suspicious of things that started in the progressive era. So I have to share your suspicion. But as an Aristotelian, I would say economics is really a part of politics rather than the other way around.
But this is, again, I think, the sense that Trump speaks for entrepreneurs, other people that are not often spoken for by traditional politicians. And I think that remains his strength, his core strength. So I think that is a strong point. Let's see.
It's an avalanche.
How about way here in the front? This is even harder for you to get to, Kirsten.
So I have a philosophy on the beginning of this lack of. Do any of you remember the great movie called Cool Hand Luke? And the prison warden used to say, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." So I have a philosophy that this failure to communicate started in 1989 when George H.W. Bush became president. So would you talk to us about, you've talked about Reagan and you've talked about Trump, but you have not talked about the great flyover presidents. So would you talk a little bit about the failure of the presidents between Reagan and Trump to communicate with the American people?
I hadn't thought of it in those terms before, J.D., but it's a good, interesting question. The Reagan, if you've read Steve Hayward's 2-volume Reagan biography, you know that he concludes by saying that Reagan completed one mission that he'd set for himself in 1981. The Soviet empire was crumbling and would soon collapse. The other big goal he set for himself to scale back big government was barely got off the launching pad. He had a great deal of trouble with that. And as Reagan said in his speech upon leaving the presidency in January of 1989, he also felt that one thing he intended to do was to rekindle a spirit of patriotism and Americanism, really, and that he was concerned. It's a surprisingly non-triumphal speech that he was concerned that hadn't really happened, and he wasn't sure whether or not it would. It seemed to me that the years that followed were ones of trying to deal with the incompleteness of these ventures, and it was true in a way of the aftermath of United Kingdom politics after Margaret Thatcher as well. You had leaders from each party who couldn't really seem to decide how far to go in the directions that had been laid out by Reagan and Thatcher. George H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president, but took office seeming to scale back the major ideological commitments and markers that Reagan had laid down. He wanted a kinder and gentler presidency, kinder and gentler implicitly than Reagan's. Bill Clinton comes along and has initial notions of being, as every Democratic president does, of being the next FDR, but within a few months is complaining to his White House advisors that because of fears about the deficit, because of constraints, even when he had a Democratic House and Senate, he said, we're all Eisenhower Republicans now. So I think that that what has happened is that we've for 28 years since Reagan left the office, he was the last sort of drawer of bright lines, and we've had a succession, four succeeding presidents who have made things murky rather than clear, and had commitments that ran in several directions rather than one clear one. So I think there's the potential now with Trump redefining what he's up to in terms of revindicating Americanism, the American idea, to have that kind of galvanizing influence on political life.
Okay. Amelia, up the second row here.
So I have a question about Trump as an executive in the executive branch, as it's currently constituted, and the differences between what he did as an executive in the private sector and that type of decisiveness, and whether you think he understands, and I think the answer is probably yes, the problem of the executive branch and its difference between a private executive, post-Wilsonian executive, post-FDR, post-Obama, right? I mean, he's in, he's fighting against some, I mean, we haven't said the word deep state yet, and but I mean, it's really the administrative state, right? I mean, he's fighting an executive branch in which there's no real ability to act as an executive. So I know both of you have written a lot about this, and I would like to hear you address whether you think he's a match or anybody's a match for fighting that particular problem of what the administrative state, the executive branch itself has become.
Right, okay.
But first, not everyone knows who Amelia is. She's the new bride of our Chief Operating Officer, Ryan Williams.
Very nice. Go ahead.
Congratulations. Well, look, it must be a shock for anyone who's a successful businessman at the scale of Donald Trump to become president of the United States. I mean, in the first place, it is almost literally true that you can fire no one. I mean that, no one. You can't fire Congress, you can't fire the courts, you can't fire the bureaucrats who work for you. You can fire the director of the FBI. And he did that. But it is a strange kind of executive in which, you know, normally, you know, what would qualify as normal business behavior. If you're the chief executive, that means you're responsible for the company. That means if you don't have the people who can make the company profitable, you've got to change those people and find some who can. It's very difficult to do that. Everything is political, not economic in that sense, and maybe in the sense in which Rock Kramer was talking about this before. You are constrained. On the other hand, you are the president. I mean, all the power of the executive branch is nominally in your hands. Vice president has nothing. You don't have to listen to your counselors. You are in charge of the whole executive branch in a way that no one in the legislature or the judiciary is at all parallel to. But the art of using executive power when you can't fire people, when everything is a political process, that doesn't mean it's all negotiation, because you can issue orders. The question is, will they carry out the orders? And what do you do if they don't carry out the orders? That is something that I'm sure is a shock and a disappointment probably, and it certainly is a challenge to him to figure out how you do that. Now, if you are Ronald Reagan and you spent 8 years as governor of California and you ran a union before that, you know something about how you have to relate to people politically and not just economically, or not just in a corporate kind of hierarchy. And this presidency is a very strange office. It has tremendous formal powers, and yet everything really depends upon the touch of the person. I mean, the ability of the person to persuade people to do what he tells them to do. This is one of the charming things about Calvin Coolidge, you know, in his autobiography. He says people would come to him all day and ask him what to do, and he would tell them, and they would go do it. And he said, why do they do that? Why do they follow those orders of mine? But they did. And you have to master that ability.
Let me pick up on one of Amelia's points. I mean, clearly Trump will have to learn the techniques of the presidency as opposed to being a CEO of a company, and that'll be hard. But Amelia also goes to this issue that my friend Steve Bannon calls deconstructing the administrative state. Not my favorite phrase, actually. I don't like the word deconstructing, but we know what he means. And that task is one of those huge tasks, like the one, Bill, that you mentioned Steve Hayward talked about for Ronald Reagan. Shrinking the federal government. This is, in a way, ratcheting it up. It's changed since Ronald Reagan. The problem is much harder. But deconstructing it, getting rid of its unconstitutional features, and returning government back to what the founders envisioned with 3 branches answerable to the people, is a very huge challenge. And I think, Amelia, you are right to ask, is that something we think Trump can do? It's hard to know now, but it's not a simple thing. Do you have a feeling about that, Bill? I mean,
well, it's extremely difficult, and as Charles says, the need for a seasoned Washington person to whom President Trump will listen and can help guide him through this maze would be a good thing at this point. But I do think that the markers that Trump has laid down lend themselves to this project. Conservatives have made clear over many years now the case against the regulatory state in terms of economic efficiency. It slows economic growth. In terms of constitutionalism, and in terms of liberty, that it empowers an administrative branch that is not accountable. But I think that Trump Jacksonian populism also creates room to make the case in terms of democracy, that people, this is the phrase I've come up with that I'm really become overly fond of, that Whereas the founders thought governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, the administrative state makes clear that government derives its just powers from the expertise of the experts. And so there's a prevailing belief in the way Washington works, the permanent government that doesn't much care who's in Congress or the White House, that because we know better, because we've studied these things, we can pretty much just go ahead and do what we're going to do. And I believe it's part of the anger that Trump tapped into throughout 2016 reflected and can be directed back at this permanent government in a way that will enhance populism and also further the pre-2016 conservative agenda.
Yeah, my hope is that because he isn't an ordinary politician and doesn't owe anything to the governing class, that maybe he has a better chance of blowing up the administrative state than others have, and because it violates his common sense of what's just. So maybe he can pull that off, if that is my hope. So I think, we have time for one more question. All right, who will it be? How about?
You can bid on it.
Over there, way over there. Yeah, you can bid on it. But let me say that we will be hanging around and you could continue to pepper these two with more and harder questions after it's over. But
maybe this is an appropriate last question. I'm wondering what Claremont and others who think similarly publish distinguished magazines and journals and speak and educate rising leaders, what can be learned from the Trump phenom, both in terms of how perhaps first principles and articulating first principles gets refined, and how it gets communicated out to the greater populace in a way that resonates for more people.
Well, let's say that the phenomenon of Trump, since you ask about this, shows us in some ways how, to use an old-fashioned word, how corrupt American politics really is now. I mean, the fact that you have to go so far out of the normal political cadres, so far out of the normal party structure, to find someone whom the people hope and pray can really change, that is, reform the government. I mean, to pass up those 16 other candidates was an extraordinary thing in the Republican primary, and then to defeat Hillary Clinton was an amazing thing. But in a way, it was a desperate, I think it was a desperate choice by the American people. I think people were very realistic about Trump. I think they understood he had many limitations. I think they understood that he was damaged goods in a certain way, that he was far from a perfect human being or was going to be a perfect president, but that given the situation of the country and the other choices before them, this was the only way out. This was the only possibility at real reform. And you can see how, that instinct, I think it was a healthy instinct, and I think it was probably inevitable under the circumstances. But how rapidly the administrative state, the permanent government, has struck back at him. I mean, the special prosecutor is itself a perfect embodiment of the unelected power of the unelected part of government, moving hand in hand with, of course, elected liberals and their purposes and their plans for the government. But, I mean, the special counsel is dubiously constitutional. To the extent it's constitutional at all, it's only because the president can fire him. I mean, do you realize that? That's really the strongest constitutional anchor of that position is that ultimately he has to be responsible to the one man who is the executive branch, who embodies the whole executive branch. If he can't fire him, that's evidence that, that it really is an unconstitutional position. But that is the kind of thing which is going to, you know, it could easily become a morass that could go on for years, and that will have all of the lack of limitations and procedures and formalities and protections that you identify with bureaucratic government at its worst. Only instead of being directed at a landowner or a property owner or someone who has to come before, you know, one of the branches of government, the IRS or others, it's going to be directed at the President of the United States. In this case, he is in the target of that kind of government. But I think, in a way, it's really only it is vindication in a way that the system fears Trump, and the antibodies of the system are all activated to go after him, and you know, and this is one way they can do it. There are other ways, of course, that they can do it as well. But it is, I think, this election in Georgia 6 yesterday probably shows there is still in the American public, you know, a deep resentment of the resistance to Trump, and so there's still a lot of healthy American patriotism and constitutionalism out there, but Trump is the instrument of that right now. He is the, I think he's, whether he completely understands this or not, he's in the position of standing for constitutional limitations and constitutional government against its enemies in current political scene.
Bill, do you want to make a comment?
And just in conclusion, that President Trump and the Republican Party have many real problems and challenges, but not just because of what happened yesterday, but because of what we've seen since November. There's every reason to think that if we had to pick between which set of problems we'd rather have, the GOPs or the Democrats, you'd much rather have the GOPs.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is a party that thought it was on the glide path to the book that came out in 2002 is titled "The Emerging Democratic Majority," and now there is anguish in their ranks as they come to grips with how difficult it will be to earn and win and deserve the trust of the American people. So I think that these things are, this is a zero-sum game, and all of these things we say about Trump and the Republicans' challenges can never lose sight of the fact that, is the old Henny Youngman joke, when compared to what, you know? We've got these problems, but they've got theirs too.
Yeah.
So
much worse. Well, let me answer as a final point, part of Kurt's question, which is the role of institutions like the Claremont Review of Books in this. And I am proud of the role that we have played in explaining and interpreting Donald Trump at a serious and sophisticated level. And that owes a lot to both Charles and Bill's contributions to the CRB, their contributions to CRB Digital, and their editing of both those organs. So I think we will continue to do that, and I encourage all of you to, yes, well, let's applaud them, absolutely. Had to work. So I hope you continue to read them and read our work, and the copies are outside, and continue to support the Claremont Institute. And as I say, we will hang around. I sense this audience has more to say and more to ask, so Charles and Bill will be around to take the questions that we haven't gotten to. And thank you all for coming. A great event.